Welcome to week 4. This week we go out of sequence on the text chapters and address chapter 15, which was written by my colleagues, Dr. Steve Housel and Carolyn Taylor, on state and local government. This chapter raises the important fact that a lot of governing that goes on in American government is done at the state and local level. The states have a constitutional mandate to look after the health, welfare, and moral education of their citizens, and that encompasses a broad array of activities. Most often, when citizens interact with government officials, they're interacting with state and local officials. Um, an important issue for understanding state and local government is the idea of a tax regime, which probably requires some explanation. A tax regime refers to the mix of taxes, income, sales, ad valorem, and various sorts of fees for services that governments use to raise revenue. The problem Oklahoma confronts is that the state economy is dominated by the oil and gas industry, and most of the campaign funding for state and local elections come from wealthier Oklahomans with ties to the oil and gas industry. And they have successfully lobbied the state to keep corporate taxes and high-end, income tax brackets fairly low. As a result, the Oklahoma legislature has created a tax regime that has systematically been incapable of drawing sufficient revenue to fund the government's operations. And as a result, over a 10-year period, they've systematically underfunded many state operations. And problems have mounted over the years and begun to percolate down to the local governments. For example, common education and higher education combined comprise 48% of Oklahoma's annual budget. Both common and higher education have been chronically underfunded since 2007. And the burden on local governments for common education is very heavy, and all too often when the state withdraws that funding, the local governments, the local school districts have to cut back, and so they go to 4-day school days. They eliminate janitorial staff. The principal ends up driving buses and doing things like that. So, with regard to higher ed, the state contribution to Rogers State University's budget is effectively where it was in 2004 when RSU transitioned from a 2-year college to a 4-year university. And that has obviously had serious impacts on our ability to, provide education. So some would say the reason for the budget shortfalls that Oklahoma has experienced was volatility in the price of oil and gas, which has historically been low due to global overproduction. Others would say the reason is the state legislature chose to create a business-friendly tax regime, which meant cutting the top marginal income tax rates that high-income Oklahomans paid, and they likewise cut the rates at which slant drillers, which is to say the folks in the oil and gas industry engaging in fracking, the rates for gross production taxes, in addition to passing significant tax breaks to create incentives for greater investment in business. Regardless, the price for that has been significant budget shortfalls and resulting cuts to state budgets for education, healthcare, and the state's penal system. Again, in that I'm referring to prisons, which we have one of the highest prison populations in the 50 states. And that has produced lots and lots of unrest. And the Oklahoma teachers walkout in the spring of 2018 highlights the fact that decision made by state governments can have a tremendous impact on people's day-to-day lives. The walkout didn't just affect teachers, it affected the parents, it affected children who returned to class just in time to face state-mandated testing. It affected custodial staff who are even more poorly paid than the teachers are. And it affects the businesses that teachers patronize. I would also note the walkout didn't happen overnight. Teachers just didn't just suddenly wake up on April the 2nd and decide to protest. Rather, it was the culmination of a series of decisions. And the Common Ed teachers were going to the Capitol for years, begging the state legislature not to cut their funding. So, and their demands were not just for more pay, but also for funding for the infrastructure so that their schools would not be crumbling. It was for greater, pay for their staff, for their custodial staff and their administrative staff so that they wouldn't lose those people. You have people that come into a job and they suddenly find they're not making enough money, so they get another job. And that creates an enormous amount of churn. And when you're constantly having to train new administrative assistants and things like that, it really creates problems. So the cuts are choices, and those choices create enormous challenges for teachers, for healthcare workers, for prison guards, and for everyone else who works, in public service in Oklahoma. As I mentioned in the overview, local government is a very daunting subject to study because there are, first of all, thousands of them, and local government's responsibilities vary considerably. For rural communities, the county governments play a big role in road construction and maintenance. Municipal governments vary widely in the size of the communities and the way the local governments are organized. Obviously, the municipal government and the resources available to a city like Oklahoma City is very different from a municipal government of a small town like Foyle. Another important part of the fiscal picture for municipal governments is, here in Oklahoma especially, the cities don't get access to ad valorem taxes. They go entirely to the counties. And that leaves cities entirely reliant on sales taxes to fund their operations. And anyone that knows anything about economics can tell you that sales taxes are extremely volatile and tend to dry up in times of recession, which is precisely when municipal governments need to be spending more on police and man hours, because when the economy goes bad, crime tends to spike. Another important issue addressed in the supplement is Dillon's Rule, which was first articulated by Judge John Forrest Dillon, who served as both a state and federal judge. Dillon's Rule essentially declares that all government units below the state level are subordinate to state governments. In his words, municipal governments owe their origin to and derive their power and rights wholly from the legislature. It breathes into them the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. As it creates, so it may destroy. If it may destroy, it may abridge and control. What are the practical consequences of that status, which effectively means that local governments have no constitutional status, right? They're not protected. They're not a constitutional institution. Effectively, state legislatures can dictate what local governments can and cannot do. To illustrate, a few years ago, energy companies were engaged in hydraulic fracturing within the city limits of Stillwater, Oklahoma. The people of Stillwater objected and subsequently passed a fracking ban within their city limits. What happened next? The energy industry went to the Oklahoma legislature and persuaded them to preempt the Stillwater ordinance and basically forbid municipal governments from fracking bans. Another issue coming to the fore in recent days, some municipal governments that host large numbers of non-citizens have passed ordinances allowing non-citizens to vote in municipal elections. Remember, local governments are effectively encompassed by the Constitution, and unless the state government bans such ordinances, what is to stop, the town of Hugo from passing an ordinance allowing everyone living in Hugo to vote in local elections? Is that a problem? If so, why? So think about the questions I've posed in this mini lecture as you read and study the assigned material, and look at the PowerPoint, because I've got both a study guide and a PowerPoint, and hopefully that'll put you in a better position to participate in the forum, even if you don't know a lot about state and local government. As always, if you have any questions, great. The forum is a perfect place to ask questions. All right, let's have a great week.